don't care. They don't care for human beings. 57 years ago, when Japan was retreating on all fronts, they decided to drop the atom bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Killed a lot of innocent people who are still suffering from the effects of those bombs. Those bombs were not aimed against the Japanese. They were aimed against the Soviet Union to say, look, this is the power that we have. If you dare oppose what we do, this is what is going to happen to you. Because they are so arrogant, they decided to kill innocent people in Japan who are still suffering from that. Who are they now to pretend that they are the policemen of the world?
The multipolar world has been developing over the last 2 decades. The current military situation is accelerating a phenomenon, a trend, a fact that is already there. And a multipolar world for sure will be a much more stable world, because just like in physics, you need more pillars on which the roof resides. And so things are accelerated by military developments, and we can see that the world is much bigger than the Northwestern Hemisphere, and this is very well reflected in today's conference as well.
I actually think that the next few weeks you will see the Ukrainian basically counteroffensive run its course. I think the Russians, what has really impressed me, again, this is not about me being pro-Russia or pro-Ukraine, just as an objective observer looking at the basic battlefield, the Russians are constantly learning from their mistakes. If you look at the development of new weapons, the Lancer drones, the Ka-52 basically helicopters, you're talking about basically the Su-34. You're talking about the night vision goggle. The Russian basically military technology has been literally like going through a revolution every 3 months. The Russians are now fighting with weapons that they didn't have 18 months ago because they didn't exist 18 months ago. And that to me is the most impressive thing. This is the reason why, whereas the West is still walking around the same circle, Russia's getting better and better, and this war is going to be won by technology in the end. Because I know the Ukrainians are good fighters, they are fearless, they're patriotic, they're just going on these suicide missions. But in the end, I think technology is going to win, and Russia is going to basically crush them. If Russia crushes basically Ukraine, that will be the end of the American hegemony as we know.
Today, Western diplomacy is clumsy. The Cambridge's Bennett Institute for Public Policy survey argues that America's tendency to divide the world into friends and enemies, the forces of democracy against autocracy, has become self-fulfilling. Regimes that see themselves as victims of American hostility, especially because of local human rights shortcomings, collaborate defensively in mutual support, fueling opposition to Washington.
We allow Germans to come offer visas here.
Max Hastings, a Bloomberg opinion columnist, experienced and hardened political scientist, a former editor-in-chief of the Daily Telegraph and the London Evening Standard, writes at Bloomberg and notes, Singaporean diplomat Kishore Mahbubani, a former president of the UN Security Council, asserts that most people on the planet want to inhabit a multipolar world, not one dominated by the US or Russia or China. This, he claims, is why many nations are not enforcing sanctions over Ukraine. In quotations, a Russian defeat, says Mahbubani, would not be in the interests of the global South. Many countries in the South, who still retain memories of the once dominant West, knows the West will once again become arrogant and insufferable if it defeats Russia completely. All this is frustrating for us Westerners. We know that we are the good guys. Our leaders repeatedly declare that it is in the vital interests of democracy and freedom-loving peoples everywhere for the Russians to be driven back to where they came from. Yet, moral conceit is besetting vice of our culture. Western nations might fare better in the conduct of foreign policy if we tried harder to understand why many don't support our campaign of Ukrainian freedom. In our own times, a YouGov poll shows that while 65% of respondents in the European democracies see Russia as an adversary, 51% of Indians, for instance, view Putin's nation as an ally. 29% see it as a necessary partner, and only 5% as an adversary. Memories still rankle among Indians of how US sanctions against Iraq and Iran drove up energy costs in the subcontinent.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And, you know, is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
India's former ambassador to Russia said in an influential recent interview, "We have not accepted the Western framing of the Ukraine conflict." Following Lavrov's recent visit to South Africa, its foreign minister Naledi Pandor recanted an earlier denunciation of Russian aggression. She applauded her country's growing economic bilateral relationship with Moscow. Meanwhile, almost all the North African nations are enthusiastically buying Russian oil. Some people characterize Russia's current activism as its great return to Africa, of which the most conspicuous manifestation is the deployment of Wagner mercenaries to stem Islamic insurgencies in Francophone West Africa and the Arabic-speaking North. In Africa, the Moscow-controlled TV outlets Sputnik and Russia Today command big audiences. China is responsible for 1/3 of all infrastructure projects in sub-Saharan Africa. In Putin's recent speech to the Russian Assembly, he denounced past Western foreign interventions in Yugoslavia, Iraq, Libya, and Syria, saying they will never be able to wash off this blood. A large foreign audience agrees with him. Sergei Lavrov is obviously right when he says, the unipolar world is irretrievably receding into the past. A multipolar world is being born. It is not that many people wish to live in Russia or China, but neither do they wish their countries to fall under American hegemony. Not to be forgotten, the US and Britain were for decades prominent supporters of South Africa's white apartheid government because of its perceived value as an anti-communist bastion in the Cold War. And efforts to export democracy by force, notably in Iraq, have backfired by resurrecting memories of colonialism. In the new world order that Lavrov believes to be evolving, the autocracies and democracies pit themselves against each other as adversaries. But many nations in between are determined to remain neutral, both from self-interest and skepticism about absolute virtue.
People talk about Russia, Ukraine. I say there is no Russia-Ukraine war at all. There is no Russia-Ukraine conflict. This is war declared by NATO on Russia. The war declared by NATO on Russia is not only for Russia, it's for dominating the whole world. It's for hegemony. This is an agenda developed after the end of the Cold War. They came up with this fantasy about containing Russia, containing any power, small, big, that challenge them technologically, economically, socially, culturally. They have to contain everybody. To me, this failure of the attempt to contain Russia will immediately move to the east. Containing China is their next agenda. They may be playing a very deceptive tactic on trying to tell everyone, oh no, we have to work with China, we have to do this and that. Their miscalculation about China has proved to be wrong. They felt probably they have the technology, they have everything. The Chinese can only copy. They will never equal them. So they will contain Russia, but make friendship with China and continue taking advantage of that so that containing Russia will be easier for them to do. Now China is out of control. Containing China from Taiwan, from India, from Japan, from South Korea, from Australia. How do they do it? How will they do it? That challenge is coming next. But first they need to deal with Russia. How are they going to deal with Russia and then next move to China? How can they deal with everybody? How do they contain us? Imagine this tiny Eritrea is being contained by them. We're being punished with their sanctions every time. We have to be punished because we're not bowing.